Part 1. Frescollone's Confidence. Frescolone stood atop the crystalline ramparts of Outpost Zeta 9, his hardened outer shell gleaming under the violet light of the binary stars overhead. His posture was poised, confident, and unwavering as he surveyed the desolate battlefield before him. The terrain stretched out in every direction, a barren wasteland scarred by the remnants of countless skirmishes. The ground was littered with the charred remains of human assault vehicles, twisted metal and smoldering wreckage from the failed attacks. Scattered among the debris were the broken bodies of human soldiers, their forms twisted grotesquely by the sheer destructive power of the Fres technology. A sense of smug satisfaction settled in his core, a warmth that contrasted with the cold, mechanical precision of his exterior. Frescolone chittered, a sound that carried with it the purest form of arrogance, to his subordinate, Fres Dexol. His tone was a low, menacing hum, full of self-assured triumph. "How many human waves did we repel today?" Frescolone asked, his voice echoing slightly in the crisp air of the outpost. Fres Dexol, a fellow soldier of his species, stood at attention nearby. His outer casing rippled in a gesture of amused disdain, a characteristic of his kind when they found something beneath them. "3, Commander," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, each more pitiful than the last. "They persist in hurling themselves against our energy barriers, as if sheer stubbornness could overcome superior Fres technology." Frescolone allowed himself a moment of pride, his chest swelling in satisfaction. The humans had been trying to breach this sector for months, their repeated attempts more desperate with each failed assault. Yet, time and again, the Fres defenses had held firm, their energy barriers and plasma cannons cutting through the human forces like a blade through tissue paper. He couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. These creatures, who had once believed themselves superior to the Fres, were now reduced to this, throwing wave after wave of soldiers against an impenetrable wall of energy, hoping for a miracle. "It's almost comical, really," Frescolone murmured to himself, gazing down at the battlefield. His tone held no mercy, only cold, detached amusement. Watching these tall, soft-bodied creatures scurry across the battlefield like insects, only to be vaporized by our plasma cannons or disintegrated against the energy shields. He let out a low chuckle, the sound reverberating through his hardened body. Frescolone knew that the humans found his kind unintimidating at first glance. After all, they were a mere 3 feet tall, with rounded bodies and tough, bark-like exteriors. The Fres had been likened to ambulatory acorns by captured human soldiers, a comparison that always amused him. They had no idea how dangerous the Fres truly were. The humans believed their advanced weaponry and towering size could intimidate the Fres, but in reality, the opposite was true. Despite their diminutive size, the Fres were built for war. Their outer shells were reinforced with the toughest materials in the galaxy, impervious to most conventional attacks. Their energy weapons were capable of obliterating anything in their path. But most importantly, their minds were sharp, calculating, and ruthless. The Fres had learned long ago that brute force was nothing without intelligence and strategy. But the humans, in their desperation, had kept throwing themselves at the Fres defenses. Frescolone had witnessed their folly firsthand. The human soldiers, though clever and resilient in their own right, were fundamentally flawed. They lacked the speed, power, and sheer technological superiority of the Fres. It was almost laughable. Watching them scramble, their oversized limbs moving awkwardly as they tried to breach the defenses, was like watching an insect trying to take down a bird of prey. As his thoughts drifted, Frescolone found himself reminiscing about some of the human prisoners he had interrogated. They spoke of their primitive cultures, of how they once fought with primitive tools, blades, swords, spears, before developing the weapons that had made them a threat. Yet, despite their claims of superiority, the Fres had defeated them time and again. The humans' greatest strength lay not in their technology, but in their adaptability, their endless capacity to learn from failure. But even that was useless against the might of the Fres Imperium. Frescolone's gaze hardened as he turned away from the battlefield, his thoughts returning to the present. The humans had proven resilient, yes, but ultimately they were no match for the Fres. "They'll learn," he muttered to himself, more to reaffirm his belief than anything else. In the end, they'll all fall. They always do. He looked to Fres Dexol, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Send a report to High Command. Tell them that Outpost Zeta 9 remains secure. The humans are no match for us. They will never break through. Fres Dexol nodded and scurried off to relay the message. Fres Cologne remained alone at the top of the rampart, his thoughts swirling. He felt the familiar thrill of victory, the sense of invincibility that had been the bedrock of his existence. The Fres Imperium was unstoppable, and he, Fres Cologne, was its proud commander. But as the violet light of the binary stars bathed the battlefield in an eerie glow, Fres Cologne couldn't shake the faintest flicker of unease that tugged at the edges of his thoughts. It was almost as if someone was watching him. He brushed it off, attributing it to his overactive mind. After all, there was no reason for worry. The Fres Imperium was unbeatable. Part 2. The first signs of trouble. A young soldier named Fres Xylos approached, his shell still smooth with youth, reflecting the pristine polish of an untested warrior. His eyes were alert, but there was a noticeable tremor in his movements, the kind that came from handling new and important information. The latest intelligence reports have arrived from High Command, Fres Xylos said, his voice carrying the faintest hint of unease. Fres Cologne turned to face him, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the young soldier. "Give me the data," he commanded, his tone steady and authoritative. Fres Xylos handed over the data crystal, a small, glowing object that pulsed with the faint light of information. Fres Cologne accepted it without a word, then inserted it into the receptor at the base of his shell. Immediately, his mind was flooded with the contents of the report. It was a standard transmission, except it wasn't. Casualty reports for the Fres were negligible, practically non-existent, while the humans had suffered catastrophic losses. Resource allocations, supply lines, and strategic assessments, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. The Fres were still in control, still dominating the battlefield, and winning this war with little effort. Yet, something in the data didn't sit right with him. He could feel it, deep in his core, as if the numbers were too neatly arranged, too easy. His instincts, honed over cycles of war, told him that such victories were never without their complications. The report confirmed that the human leadership was pulling forces from the Orion front to reinforce this sector, a move that showed they were far from giving up. "They still believe they can break through our lines," Fres Cologne muttered to himself, disbelief mixing with a trace of curiosity. How quaint. He turned to his officers, his expression hardening. "It seems the human leadership grows desperate," he announced, his voice cutting through the quiet of the command center. "They're pulling forces from the Orion front to reinforce this sector. They still believe they can break through our lines." Fres Cologne let out a series of rapid clicks, his version of a derisive laugh. His officers joined in, the sound echoing off the walls of the command pod as they savored the absurdity of the humans' persistence. To them, it was laughable. The Fres technology was far beyond anything the humans could even imagine, and yet they continued to throw themselves at the Fres defenses, like moths to a flame. It was almost as if they were willing to die for a lost cause. Part 3. The Unusual Weapon. As night fell and the binary stars dipped below the horizon, the cool shadows of the night settled in around Outpost Zeta 9. The brilliant violet light that had bathed the battlefield all day now faded into an eerie twilight. Fres Cologne retired to his command pod, a small but efficient structure at the heart of the outpost. Inside, the air was thick with the soft hum of energy systems, and a calming nutrient mist filled the chamber, designed to refresh and recharge the Fres as they rested. Fres Cologne allowed his outer shell to relax slightly, his muscles loosening after the tense day. He leaned back, basking in the mist as it filled his core with the vital nutrients he needed to sustain his energy for another day of battle. Tomorrow would bring more human assaults, more futile attempts to overcome the undeniable superiority of the Fres Imperium. And Fres Cologne would be there, as he had been for the past stellar cycle, to send them screaming back to their primitive colonies. The thought of it brought a deep sense of satisfaction, even pride. The Fres had always been the superior force. No species, not even the humans, could defeat them. Yet, just before he entered his regenerative cycle, A stray thought crossed his mind, one that lingered like a shadow in the back of his consciousness. The humans had proven surprisingly resilient for such a technologically inferior species. Time and again, they had adapted their tactics, invented new weapons, and found ways to survive where any logical assessment said they should have perished. Despite their losses, despite their primitive nature, the humans refused to give up. They kept adapting, evolving, finding new ways to fight back. But in the end, Frescolone reminded himself it wouldn't matter. No amount of human ingenuity could stand against the full might of the Fress Imperium. The technological gap between their species was far too wide. The Fress had energy shields that could stop anything the humans had thrown at them, and plasma cannons that could obliterate entire battalions in a single shot. The Fress were a race of unparalleled intellect and power, owned through countless millennia of warfare. The humans were no match for them. As he lay back in the regenerative pod, the nutrient mist swirling around him, Frescolone felt his thoughts drift. The humans had certainly impressed him in some ways. He had to admit that. But in the end, their resilience would be their undoing. Their persistence, their refusal to accept defeat, would only lead them to more failure. It was only a matter of time before the Fress crushed them completely. Their defeat was as inevitable as the rise of the binary stars themselves. Frescolone's thoughts were interrupted by the soft, rhythmic hum of his regenerative cycle beginning to take effect. He closed his eyes and allowed his body to relax completely, the overwhelming sense of victory once again filling his thoughts. Tomorrow, he would wake and continue his mission to keep the humans at bay, to push them back and remind them of their place. They had no chance. The Fress were invincible. Part 4. The Mysterious Attack. Frescolone was in the middle of his daily tactical review, his mind focused on the status reports and resource allocations that were now second nature to him. The data flowed effortlessly into his consciousness as he reviewed the latest military strategies. The humans had made no significant progress in recent weeks, and everything seemed to be falling into place for another decisive victory. The Fress were unstoppable. They had everything in their favor: superior technology, unmatched strength, and an impenetrable defense network. The war, in his mind, was all but over. But just as he was about to settle into the comfortable rhythm of his routine, the silence of the command center was shattered by a sudden, frantic intrusion. The door slid open with a sharp hiss, and Fress Isos, a younger officer, burst into the room, his outer shell vibrating with agitation. He was clearly unsettled, his movements erratic and rapid. "Commander, urgent communique from Outpost Epsilon 12, Fress Isos chittered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "They're under attack, but something's different. The humans are using— It doesn't make sense, sir." Frescolone turned sharply, the calm that had previously enveloped him replaced by a growing sense of unease. The last thing he expected was a disruption of this magnitude. His sharp mandibles clicked in irritation as he focused his attention entirely on Fress Isos. "What do you mean, something's different?" Frescolone's voice was clipped, a trace of suspicion creeping into his tone. "What are the humans doing now?" Fress Isos hesitated for a moment, his shell shimmering with the visible signs of nervousness. "They're using— well, it's difficult to explain, Commander. They're using swords." For a moment, the command center fell into stunned silence. The mention of swords, primitive, archaic weapons, seemed utterly out of place. The Fress officers exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. How could something as outdated and ineffective as a sword have any impact against the most advanced military force in the galaxy? Frescolone, however, was quick to suppress any hint of doubt. His outer shell rippled in amusement, a gesture he often used when faced with what he considered ludicrous reports. "Swords?" he asked, his tone dripping with derision, his voice echoing through the command center. "Against our energy barriers and plasma cannons? Surely this is some kind of joke." He could feel the smugness rising within him, as if the very notion of humans wielding swords in battle was laughable. The idea that a primitive weapon like a sword could do any harm to the mighty Fress Imperium was absurd. His own plasma cannons had vaporized entire armies in a single blast. No sword could ever hope to breach their defenses. But as the days wore on, the reports didn't stop. In fact, They only grew more frequent, and each one told a story that was increasingly difficult to ignore. Similar accounts arrived from other fronts, each recounting the same baffling tale. Humans clad in heavy armor, wielding swords and other archaic melee weapons, somehow managing to breach Fresk defenses that had once been thought impenetrable. The Fresk had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, their energy shields and plasma weapons capable of halting any assault, no matter how fierce. Yet here they were, facing an enemy that was somehow inexplicably bypassing their defenses. The reports didn't make sense. How could swords, simple, crude blades, pierce the impenetrable barriers that had stopped the most advanced weapons? Fresk alone found himself pacing restlessly in his command pod, his thoughts in turmoil. The human weapons didn't seem to have the destructive power of Fresk plasma cannons, but they were somehow managing to bypass the energy fields. There had to be an explanation. Could the humans have developed some kind of new technology, something the Fresk hadn't anticipated? Or had they discovered some ancient method to counter Fresk's superiority? Fresk Cologne's mind raced, searching for answers. The idea that the humans had somehow managed to breach Fresk technology was almost unfathomable. It shook the very foundation of everything he had believed. The Fresk had always been the conquerors, the superior species. The humans were supposed to be an inferior, technologically primitive race, incapable of ever matching the might of the Fresk Imperium. Yet somehow, these humans had found a way to do the impossible. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He could no longer dismiss this new development with derision. No, the humans were adapting faster than the Fresk had expected. If they could find a way to breach the seemingly invincible barriers of the Fresk, what else might they be capable of? Swords, Fresk Cologne muttered to himself, his mandibles clicking in frustration. He had to know more. Prepare additional reconnaissance. I want full scans of the human forces. Find out what they are doing, how they are bypassing our defenses. This can't be happening. The growing concern. Fresk Cologne stood before a holographic display, his eyes narrowing as he studied the latest intelligence reports. He had just reviewed another transmission detailing the human assaults, with repeated mentions of their continued use of swords, an absurdity that he still couldn't comprehend. There had to be a logical explanation, he thought. It couldn't be true. Surely, this was just another desperate attempt to demoralize the mighty Fresk forces. Fresk Cologne scoffed at the thought, his mandibles clicking with disdain. He dismissed the reports as mere human propaganda, a pitiful effort to rattle the invincible Fresk Imperium. Preposterous, he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with annoyance. Next, they'll tell us the humans are training attack trees or some such nonsense. The idea of these fragile, resource-deprived creatures wielding such primitive weapons felt beneath him. They were nothing more than insects trying to threaten a predator far superior in every way. Across the command table, Fresk Dexal, his most trusted subordinate, watched carefully, his face unreadable. The older Fresk officer's outer shell rippled with the slightest flicker of concern, though he masked it well. The commander's dismissive attitude had been the norm for so long, but this time, it seemed wrong to ignore the growing body of evidence. With all due respect, Commander, Fresk Dexal said in his usual calm tone, perhaps we should not be so quick to dismiss these reports. The humans have proven unpredictable in the past. His words were measured, careful not to provoke the commander further, but also conveying the importance of taking a more cautious approach. Fresk Cologne's response was immediate and sharp. His shell hardened with indignation, the metallic surfaces of his body darkening slightly as a wave of anger swept over him. Are you suggesting that we, the mighty Fresk, should fear humans with swords? His voice was low and filled with scorn, each word a pointed accusation. I expected better from you, Fresk Dexal. You're implying that our victory is not as assured as I've always believed? The frustration was clear in his voice. Fresk Dexal, someone who had served under him for countless cycles, was questioning his judgment. That was not acceptable. The command center fell silent. Even the subtle hum of the machinery seemed to pause, as if it, too, was waiting for the next move. Fresk Dexal didn't flinch, though, and after a moment of heavy silence, he spoke again, his voice unwavering. Not fear, Commander, Fresk Dexal said, his tone still steady but with a hint of urgency. But caution, even the greatest warriors are undone by overconfidence. The humans are more resourceful than we give them credit for. You yourself have seen how they adapt in ways no other species does. I believe they are planning something we have not yet fully understood. Frescollone's thoughts were in turmoil. Dexel's words weren't lost on him, and they struck a chord deep in his core. The Fres had never been so dismissive of their enemies before. Every other species they had encountered had eventually crumbled under the might of the Fres Imperium. But the humans, these fragile, noisy creatures, had survived longer than any other species had a right to. They had a knack for surviving where others would have perished. Despite the anger bubbling within him, Frescolone knew that his subordinate had a point. The idea of surrendering to the humans, of allowing them to gain any ground, was incomprehensible to him. Yet he couldn't ignore the creeping unease gnawing at him, the unease that told him something was different this time. Frescolone took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. The war was not over, not yet, and it would not be lost on his watch. "Fine," he said, his tone cold and commanding, the anger having cooled into a more deliberate calm. "I'll increase surveillance of the surrounding space. We'll find out what the humans are planning. If they are truly devising some new strategy, we will meet it with the full force of the Fres Imperium. But if it turns out to be another one of their pathetic tricks, then I'll be the one laughing." Fres Dexel nodded without hesitation, understanding the commander's decision. He had never known Frescolone to back down from a challenge, and he didn't expect him to start now. Despite his bravado, however, a part of Frescolone couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. What if the humans had found something, some new, unforeseen weakness in the Fres technology? What if their ancient weapons held more than just symbolic value? He quickly pushed the thought aside. There was no room for weakness. The Fres Imperium would not fall. They were the pinnacle of evolution. And no matter what weapons the humans wielded, they would not survive the power of the Fres. Part 6. The Growing Threat. It was Fres Xylos who first spotted the anomaly. He was monitoring the edge of the sector, his sharp senses attuned to the usual patterns of human movement and activity. But this time, something was different. A cluster of human ships was approaching, and the trajectory was entirely unusual. The vessels were not behaving as expected. Fres Xylos' antennae twitched as he tracked the ships, his eyes narrowing in focus. He quickly ran a series of calculations, but the results didn't add up. The ships were moving in a way that suggested careful, deliberate coordination. There was no chaos, no rush. It was as if the humans knew exactly what they were doing, and that thought alone made Fres Xylos uneasy. He immediately relayed the information to Frescolone. "Commander, there's something strange going on. A group of human ships is approaching on an unusual vector. Their energy signatures, they're off, somehow muted." Frescolone, who had been reviewing tactical data on his own console, stiffened, his mind raced. Muted energy signatures? That didn't make sense. Human vessels typically emitted a distinct, identifiable energy pattern that Fres technology had long learned to monitor and counter. But this was something new, something they hadn't accounted for. "Scan them," Frescolone ordered, his voice calm but carrying a note of worry that crept in despite his best efforts to suppress it. He was a commander, and commanders didn't show weakness, but something in the back of his mind had been set on edge. Something was wrong, and it was starting to feel like a creeping shadow that threatened to swallow him whole. The scan results took only a few moments to complete, but the data they presented were more troubling than Frescolone had imagined. The ships were heavily armored, far more so than any human vessels he had encountered in the past. Their exterior layers shimmered with unfamiliar energy patterns, almost as if they were designed specifically to avoid detection or neutralize conventional weapons. This was no ordinary human fleet. These ships had been crafted for a purpose, and that purpose was becoming clearer by the moment. But it wasn't just the armor that puzzled him. The cargo bays of the ships, when scanned, were filled with something entirely unexpected. Instead of the usual cargo of energy weapons, explosives, or other standard supplies, the scans showed large quantities of refined metal, long, thin, and curiously shaped forms. Frescollone's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately began to piece together the implications of what he was seeing, and the dread that began to settle in his core was undeniable. "Impossible," he whispered, his mandibles clicking in disbelief. His outer shell, which had once been a proud and impenetrable armor, now paled slightly. His breath, if one could call it that, caught in his chest. The implications were staggering. He had seen many things in his long military career, but nothing like this. The human ships weren't just carrying refined metal, they were carrying raw materials. And those materials, they were shaped into long, thin forms that looked eerily like swords. For a moment, Frescolone felt a wave of cold wash over him. His mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The humans were not simply relying on their traditional tactics anymore. They weren't trying to break through the Fresh defenses with their crude weapons or outdated technology. No, they had adapted. They were building something new, something that could bypass the Fresh's most advanced shields and weapons. The idea of humans wielding swords against the might of the Fresh Imperium was laughable, absurd even. But this was different. The weapons they were bringing weren't just crude blades. They were constructed from materials that could resist the energy barriers that had once been invincible. They were not primitive relics, but highly sophisticated, reinforced blades, likely infused with technology capable of dealing a blow to the Fresh's impenetrable defenses. Frescolone could feel the tension rising in his body as the weight of the revelation settled over him. These humans had somehow discovered a way to counter everything the Fresh had worked so hard to perfect. The armor they were wearing, the strange weapons they had forged, it was all part of a strategy he hadn't anticipated. He had underestimated them. His smug confidence, his certainty in the superiority of the Fresh Imperium had left him blind to the humans' ingenuity. "Commander," Fresh Xylos's voice broke through his thoughts, still tinged with unease. "What should we do? The ships are closing in. Should we prepare the defenses?" Frescolone took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He had to act quickly. His instinct was to dismiss this as yet another human trick, another desperate ploy to break the morale of the Fresh forces. But the evidence was mounting, and he couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. "No," he finally said, his voice steely and resolute. "We will not underestimate them again. Increase surveillance on the fleet. Prepare for any eventuality. If they are planning something that can breach our defenses, we will be ready." Part 10. The Shocking Turn. The massive energy field sprang to life with a thunderous hum, the shimmering wall of pure power flickering into existence before Frescollone's eyes. The shields were a masterpiece of Fresh technology, capable of repelling anything that came into contact with them. For a moment, Frescolone allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The humans had made their move, and their primitive weapons would break against the defenses like every other human assault before it. But then, something impossible happened. The human figures, their swords held high, charged forward. Frescolone watched, expecting to see them disintegrate, vaporized in an instant by the overwhelming power of the energy barrier. It was the natural order of things. The energy field was invincible. The humans didn't stand a chance. Except, they weren't vaporized. To the utter astonishment of every Fresh watching, the human soldiers passed through the energy barrier as if it wasn't even there. The shimmering wall of energy did nothing to stop them. Their armor, now fully visible, seemed to shimmer and flex as they moved through the field. Somehow, it absorbed or deflected the massive energies that should have annihilated them. Frescollone's breath hitched. He couldn't believe his eyes. How was this possible? The energy barrier should have destroyed them instantly. And yet, the humans were advancing, their swords held high, unstoppable. This was no longer just an assault, it was a terrifying breakthrough. Frescollone's mind raced. What had gone wrong? How had they broken through? The humans had done the impossible. The Fresh had always believed themselves untouchable, invincible. But this new weapon, this new strategy, it was something entirely different. And for the first time in his long career, Frescolone felt a chill of fear race through his body. His mind was already working overtime, running calculations and scenarios, trying to predict what the humans might do next. Their tactics had always been unpredictable, but this new development, this new weapon, was something Fres Cologne had never encountered. He knew that no matter how advanced the Fres were, no matter how superior their technology, this time, the humans had managed to level the playing field. And as the ships drew closer, Fres Cologne couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Part 7. The Unexpected Breakthrough. As if to confirm his worst fears, a transmission suddenly crackled through the command center, cutting through the hum of machinery and chatter. The message was urgent, filled with static and heavy breaths, and it immediately commanded attention. "This is Gamma 7. We are under attack." The voice came from the commander at Outpost Gamma 7, the nearest Fres stronghold to their position. It was frantic, filled with disbelief and panic. "The humans, they've breached the perimeter. They're inside the barriers. How? How are they doing this? They're cutting through our troops with swords." The transmission cut off abruptly, the static consuming the last desperate words of the Gamma 7 commander. A deathly silence fell over the command center as the full weight of what had just been said sank in. Every Fres soldier in the room stood frozen, staring at the screens, trying to process the impossible reality of what they had just heard. Fres Cologne felt something inside him, a deep, cold sensation, creep through his core. A sensation he had never experienced before. Fear. It was not the fear of a minor setback or a skirmish lost. It was something deeper, something paralyzing, something that seemed to reach inside and gnaw at the very foundation of his being. Cold, clammy fear seeped through his hardened shell and into his very core. His mind raced. The humans had breached a Fres stronghold. They had gotten through the impenetrable barriers, the most advanced defenses the galaxy had ever known. They had done so with swords. It was incomprehensible, and yet the transmission was real. "Alert stations," Fres Cologne heard himself say. His voice sounded distant and strange to his own ears, detached from the gravity of the moment. "Prepare for imminent attack, and send word to High Command. Tell them." He paused, unable to believe the words he was about to utter. "Tell them the humans are coming, and this time they have swords." His command was obeyed immediately, though the feeling of dread and disbelief continued to gnaw at him. Whatever was happening, the Fres were not prepared for it. Part 8. The battle begins. The sudden blare of klaxons throughout Outpost Zeta 9 snapped Fres Cologne back to reality. The shrill alarm echoed across every corridor, sending waves of urgency through the command center. Every Fres officer began to move with mechanical precision, activating shields, scanning the horizon, and preparing weapons for an attack that no one had truly expected. Fres Cologne stood still, his eyes fixed on the starfield outside the outpost. A sinking feeling began to claw at him, a premonition that something catastrophic was about to unfold. Whatever was coming, he had a disturbing sense that all his advanced weaponry and impenetrable barriers might not be enough to stop it.